Sarah Mitchell was only 19 years old when she made the biggest mistake of her life. She trusted the wrong person. What started as an innocent conversation on social media with someone who claimed to be a modeling scout had turned into a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. The man had convinced her to meet him at a coffee shop in downtown Atlanta, promising her a bright future in fashion modeling. He seemed legitimate at first, showing her what appeared to be professional contracts and speaking knowledgeably about the industry. Marcus Williams had been driving for 12 hours straight, making his way from North Carolina back to his home in Texas after visiting his elderly mother. The former Marine had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and now worked as a construction supervisor, but his military training never left him. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations, a skill that had kept him alive overseas and served him well in civilian life. As he pulled into the rest stop along Interstate 20 in rural Georgia, all he wanted was to stretch his legs, grab a cup of coffee, and maybe catch a few minutes of rest before continuing his journey. The rest stop was nearly empty at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. Most travelers had either reached their destinations or were still hours away from needing a break. Marcus parked his pickup truck near the main building and walked toward the vending machines, his boots echoing on the concrete. The Georgia heat was oppressive even in the shade, and he was grateful for the slight breeze that offered minimal relief. Sarah sat on a bench near the far end of the rest stop, trying to appear calm while her heart raced with terror. The man who had lured her here, David Chen, was inside the building making what he called business calls. But Sarah knew better now. She had overheard enough of his conversations to understand that she was being sold like a piece of property. The realization had hit her like a physical blow when she heard him discussing the merchandise and delivery schedules, while thinking she was asleep in the passenger seat of his sedan. The past 3 days had been a blur of constant movement, cheap motels and growing fear. David had taken her phone immediately after picking her up, claiming it was for security reasons during the initial stages of her modeling career. He had driven her hundreds of miles from Atlanta, stopping only when necessary and always watching her like a hawk. Sarah had tried to escape once at a gas station in Alabama, but David had caught her before she could reach the attendant. His friendly demeanor had vanished instantly, replaced by cold threats about what would happen if she tried anything like that again. Now, sitting at this isolated rest stop, Sarah knew this might be her last chance. David had told her they would be meeting his business partners soon, and something in his tone made it clear that once that happened, her fate would be sealed. She had spent the morning trying to think of ways to signal for help without alerting David, but every plan seemed impossible. She was too afraid to approach other travelers directly, knowing that David was watching from inside and would intervene before she could explain her situation. Marcus noticed the young woman immediately, not because she was doing anything obvious, but because of what she wasn't doing. In his experience, people at rest stops fell into predictable patterns. They used the facilities, bought snacks, stretched their legs, or rested briefly before moving on. This girl was sitting perfectly still, her posture rigid with tension, her eyes constantly darting between the building behind her and the parking lot in front of her. She looked like someone trying very hard to appear normal while being anything but. The former Marine had learned to trust his instincts, and right now they were telling him something was very wrong. The girl appeared to be alone, but her behavior suggested she was being watched. Marcus had seen that same look in the eyes of civilians in war zones who were too terrified to ask for help directly, but desperately hoped someone would notice their plight. He decided to observe the situation more carefully before taking any action. As Marcus pretended to study the vending machine options, he kept the girl in his peripheral vision. She kept glancing toward the rest stop building, and her body language screamed distress. When a family with young children approached the picnic area nearby, Marcus watched as the girl seemed to consider approaching them, but then stopped herself, shrinking back onto the bench as if she had been warned against such behavior. It was then that Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. The girl was making small, deliberate movements with her hands, tapping out a pattern on her leg that he recognized immediately. It was Morse code for SOS. She was repeating it over and over, probably hoping that someone, anyone, would understand her silent plea for help. The realization that this young woman was in serious danger galvanized Marcus into action, though he knew he had to be smart about how he approached the situation. Marcus quickly formulated a plan, drawing on his military training to assess the tactical situation. He needed to confirm his suspicions about the girl's distress while identifying any potential threats. Moving casually toward the picnic tables, he positioned himself where he could observe both the girl and the rest stop building. He pulled out his phone and pretended to make a call, using the opportunity to study the situation more carefully. Sarah noticed the tall, well-built man with the military bearing almost immediately. Something about his careful, purposeful movements reminded her of her uncle, who had served in the army. When she saw him glancing in her direction while apparently talking on his phone, a desperate hope flickered in her chest. She began tapping out the SOS signal more deliberately, praying that if this man had military experience, he might recognize what she was doing. Inside the rest stop building, David was growing increasingly agitated during his phone conversations. The buyers he was supposed to meet had changed their plans twice already, and he was beginning to suspect they might be law enforcement officers conducting a sting operation. His paranoia was making him sloppy, and he kept glancing outside to check on Sarah while trying to negotiate new terms with his contacts. The delays were making him nervous, and nervous people in his line of work often made fatal mistakes. Marcus confirmed his worst fears when he finally got a clear look at the girl's hands. She was definitely tapping out SOS in Morse code, and the desperation in her movements told him she had been doing it for some time. He ended his fake phone call and began walking slowly in her direction, careful not to appear threatening or draw attention from whoever might be watching her. As he got closer, he could see that she was very young, probably still a teenager, and clearly terrified. When Marcus was close enough to speak quietly, he stopped near a trash can and spoke without looking directly at Sarah. "Miss, I'm a former Marine, and I can see your SOS signal," he said in a low, calm voice. "If you're in danger, tap once. If you need immediate help, tap twice." The relief that flooded through Sarah was almost overwhelming. Someone had finally understood her desperate message. Sarah tapped twice on her leg, trying to keep the movement subtle in case David was watching from the building. Marcus nodded slightly and continued speaking in the same quiet, reassuring tone. "I'm going to help you, but I need you to tell me what we're dealing with. Is there someone in that building who has you against your will?" Sarah tapped once for yes, then held up one finger low against her leg to indicate there was one person. "Okay, good. You're doing great," Marcus whispered, his military training kicking into high gear. "I need to know if this person is armed. Do you know if he has a weapon?" Sarah's eyes widened with fear and she tapped once. She had seen David's gun when he had shown it to her as a threat during her failed escape attempt at the gas station. The sight of the weapon had crushed any remaining hope she had harbored about this being a legitimate modeling opportunity. Marcus felt his jaw tighten as the full scope of the situation became clear. This was likely a human trafficking case, which meant the stakes couldn't be higher. He had dealt with similar situations overseas, where young women were often caught up in criminal networks against their will. The difference was that here on American soil, he couldn't simply call in an airstrike or a military response team. He needed to be smart, careful, and above all, ensure the girl's safety while neutralizing the threat. "Listen to me carefully," Marcus continued, still maintaining his casual posture, while scanning the rest stop for other potential threats. "I'm going to call for backup, but it's going to take time for help to arrive. In the meantime, I need you to stay exactly where you are and keep acting normal. If this man comes out and tries to leave with you, I want you to drop to the ground immediately. Don't worry about looking foolish or causing a scene. Can you do that for me?" Sarah tapped once, feeling a surge of hope for the first time in days. Having someone who understood the danger and was willing to help made her feel less alone than she had since this nightmare began. She could see that this man had the kind of confidence and competence that came from real experience in dangerous situations. For the first time since David had taken her phone and driven her away from Atlanta, she began to believe she might actually survive this ordeal. Marcus moved away from Sarah, pulling out his phone to call 911 while keeping the rest stop building under observation. As he waited for the emergency dispatcher to answer, he noticed a sedan with tinted windows parked in a location that provided a clear view of Sarah's position. The tactical placement of the vehicle confirmed his suspicions about the professionalism of whoever was behind this operation. This wasn't some random crime of opportunity. It was a carefully planned human trafficking operation. The 911 dispatcher answered, and Marcus quickly but clearly explained the situation. "This is Marcus Williams, former Marine. I'm at the rest stop on Interstate 20, mile marker 47, and I have a possible human trafficking situation in progress. There's a young woman being held against her will, and her captor is armed and inside the building. I need immediate law enforcement response, and please advise them to approach with caution, as the suspect may flee with the victim if he becomes aware of police presence." The 911 dispatcher took Marcus's information seriously, especially when he mentioned his military background and provided specific tactical details about the situation. She assured him that multiple units were being dispatched, including specialized officers trained in human trafficking cases. However, she warned him that response time would be at least 15 minutes due to the remote location of the rest stop. Marcus knew that 15 minutes could be an eternity in a situation like this. As if on cue, David emerged from the rest stop building, his face dark with frustration. Marcus could immediately see why Sarah was terrified of this man. David moved with the predatory confidence of someone accustomed to controlling others through fear and intimidation. His eyes swept the rest stop area with practiced awareness before settling on Sarah, and Marcus could see the girl's body tense with fear even from his position across the parking lot. David approached Sarah with measured steps, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet afternoon air. "Time to go," he said simply, but the underlying threat in his tone was unmistakable. "My contacts want to meet at a different location." Sarah remained seated, trying to follow Marcus's instructions to stay in place, but David's expression darkened when she didn't immediately comply. "I said it's time to go," he repeated, reaching toward her arm. Marcus knew he had to act. The girl was in immediate danger, and waiting for law enforcement backup might mean she disappeared forever into a criminal network. Drawing on his combat experience, he began walking toward David and Sarah, projecting calm authority while keeping his hands visible and non-threatening. "Excuse me," he called out in a friendly voice, "is this your daughter?" David spun around, clearly surprised by the interruption. His hand moved instinctively toward his waistband where Marcus suspected he kept his weapon. "This doesn't concern you," David replied, his accent revealing stress that hadn't been apparent in his controlled demeanor moments earlier. "We're just leaving." "Oh, I'm sorry," Marcus continued, maintaining his innocent act while positioning himself strategically. "It's just that she looks upset, and I wanted to make sure everything was okay. I'm a father myself, and you know how teenage girls can get when they're tired from a long road trip." His casual manner was deliberately designed to appear non-threatening, while giving Sarah time and creating witnesses. If other travelers arrived, Sarah recognized what Marcus was doing and seized the opportunity he was creating for her. "Please help me," she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper but clearly audible. "He's not my father. He took me from Atlanta 3 days ago." The words tumbled out in a rush, 3 days of terror and desperation finally finding voice. David's mask slipped completely. "Shut up," he snapped at Sarah, then turned back to Marcus with undisguised hostility. "Mind your own business and walk away. This girl is lying because she's in trouble with her family." But his body language told a different story, and Marcus could see his hand moving closer to his concealed weapon. "I don't think she's lying," Marcus replied, his tone shifting from friendly to firm. He had dropped his casual posture, and now stood with the balanced stance of someone prepared for violence. "In fact, I think you need to step away from her right now." His military training was fully engaged now, and he was calculating angles, distances, and potential cover positions while keeping his eyes locked on David's hands. David realized that his situation had deteriorated rapidly. This stranger wasn't going to be intimidated or convinced to walk away, and the girl had already compromised his story. He had two choices: abandon Sarah and flee, or escalate the situation by drawing his weapon. Years of criminal experience had taught him that witnesses were dangerous, especially witnesses who looked like they knew how to handle themselves in a fight. "You're making a big mistake," David warned, his hand now openly resting on his weapon. "You have no idea who you're messing with." But even as he issued the threat, he was evaluating his options. The rest stop was isolated, but other travelers could arrive at any moment. The longer this confrontation continued, the more likely it became that law enforcement would arrive or other witnesses would appear. Marcus could see the calculation in David's eyes and knew the situation was reaching a critical point. "The only mistake here is yours," he replied calmly. "I've already called the police and they're on their way. Your best option is to walk away right now and disappear before they arrive." It was a calculated risk, revealing that law enforcement had been contacted. But Marcus hoped it might convince David to flee rather than escalate to violence. The revelation that police had been called changed everything for David. His entire operation was now compromised, and staying to fight would only make his situation worse. But abandoning Sarah meant losing a significant financial investment and potentially exposing him to retaliation from the criminal network he worked for. As these thoughts raced through his mind, he made the decision that would determine whether this situation ended peacefully or in bloodshed. Sarah watched the deadly chess match playing out between the two men, understanding that her life hung in the balance of decisions being made in the next few seconds. She could see the tension in both men's bodies and knew that whatever happened next would happen quickly. For the first time since her ordeal began, however, she felt like someone was fighting for her instead of against her. David made his choice in a split second, drawing his pistol from its concealed position with practiced speed. But Marcus had been watching for exactly this movement, and his military reflexes kicked in automatically. As David's weapon cleared his waistband, Marcus was already moving, diving sideways while shouting, "Get down!" to Sarah. The young woman immediately dropped to the ground behind the concrete bench, following Marcus's earlier instructions perfectly. The first shot rang out across the empty rest stop, the sound echoing off the concrete buildings and seeming impossibly loud in the quiet afternoon. David had aimed hastily, and his bullet struck the pavement where Marcus had been standing a fraction of a second earlier. The former Marine rolled behind a concrete trash receptacle, using it as cover while assessing his tactical situation. Marcus was unarmed, having left his own legally carried pistol locked in his truck as a precaution when he entered what he thought would be a routine rest stop visit. Now he was facing an armed opponent with nothing but his training and whatever improvised weapons he could find. The concrete trash receptacle provided decent cover, but it also limited his mobility, and David was already adjusting his position to get a better angle. "You should have minded your own business," David called out, moving to flank Marcus's position while keeping his pistol trained in the direction of the trash receptacle. His voice carried the cold professionalism of someone who had used violence to solve problems before. "Now you're going to die for nothing, and the girl comes with me anyway." Sarah pressed herself against the ground behind the bench, terrified but trying to think of ways to help her unexpected protector. She could see David moving to get a better shot at Marcus, and she realized that her rescuer was trapped behind inadequate cover. Drawing on reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed, she began looking around for anything she could use as a weapon or distraction. Marcus knew he had to move before David could establish a superior firing position. Using a technique from his urban combat training, he grabbed a handful of gravel and threw it to his left while rolling quickly to his right. The sound of the gravel hitting the ground drew David's attention and gunfire for just a moment, giving Marcus enough time to reach better cover behind a concrete picnic table. The sound of gunshots had an immediate effect on the rest stop environment. A family that had been approaching in their minivan heard the shots and immediately turned around, the father flooring the accelerator to get his wife and children away from the danger. This was exactly what Marcus had hoped would happen. Fewer innocent bystanders meant he could focus entirely on neutralizing David without worrying about collateral casualties. David fired 2 more shots at Marcus's new position, both bullets striking the concrete table and sending chips of stone flying. The thick concrete absorbed most of the impact, but Marcus could feel the vibrations from each hit. He needed to find a way to close the distance and neutralize David's weapon advantage before the man could establish a position with a clear line of sight. Suddenly, Sarah spotted something that might help. Near her hiding place behind the bench was a maintenance shed with tools scattered around its base. Among them was a heavy pipe wrench that had apparently been left behind by workers. Moving as quietly as possible, she crawled toward the tool, hoping to get it to Marcus somehow or create a distraction that might give him an advantage. The sound of approaching sirens began to echo faintly in the distance, still miles away but growing gradually louder. David heard them too, and Marcus could see the panic beginning to set in as the criminal realized his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Desperate people made mistakes, Marcus knew, but they also became more dangerous and unpredictable. "You hear that?" Marcus called out from behind his cover. "It's over. Put down the weapon and surrender now and you might live through this." He was trying to accelerate David's panic, hoping to force him into making a tactical error that would create an opening for counterattack. Instead of surrendering, David made a crucial mistake born of desperation and anger. He charged toward Marcus's position, firing rapidly while advancing in an attempt to overwhelm his opponent with aggression. It was a move that might have worked against an untrained civilian, but Marcus had faced similar attacks from insurgents in Afghanistan, and he knew exactly how to respond. As David rushed his position, Marcus waited until the last possible moment before rolling out from behind the table in the opposite direction of David's charge. The criminal's momentum carried him past Marcus's former position, and for a brief moment his back was turned to the former Marine. Marcus seized the opportunity, launching himself at David's legs in a tackle that sent both men crashing to the ground. The impact knocked David's pistol from his hand, sending it skittering across the concrete several feet away. Both men scrambled toward the weapon, but Marcus's military combat training gave him a significant advantage in close-quarters fighting. He managed to reach the gun first, kicking it away from both of them before turning to face David's continued attack. What followed was a brief but intense hand-to-hand combat situation. David was desperate and fighting for his freedom, while Marcus was fighting to protect Sarah and prevent a dangerous criminal from escaping. The former Marine's training and superior conditioning quickly became apparent as he systematically disabled David's attempts at striking back, finally managing to pin the criminal face down on the concrete, with his arm twisted behind his back in a submission hold. Sarah emerged from her hiding place, still clutching the pipe wrench she had retrieved, and ran toward the two men. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice shaking with relief and residual fear. Marcus maintained his hold on David while breathing heavily from the exertion of the fight. "It's over," he confirmed, looking up at the brave young woman who had endured so much. "You're safe now." The first police cruiser arrived just 3 minutes after the fight ended, followed quickly by 2 more patrol cars and an unmarked detective vehicle. Marcus remained in control of David until the officers could take custody of the suspect, carefully explaining the situation to the lead officer while still maintaining his restraining hold on the criminal. The police officers were initially cautious, not knowing which man was the threat until Marcus calmly identified himself and provided a clear account of what had transpired. Sarah found herself surrounded by concerned law enforcement officers and paramedics who wanted to examine her for injuries and begin the process of documenting her ordeal. Detective Lisa Rodriguez, a specialist in human trafficking cases, took charge of Sarah's care with the gentle professionalism of someone who had worked with many trafficking victims. She understood that Sarah would need time and patience to tell her story fully, and that the young woman had endured trauma that would take time to process. As David was placed under arrest and read his rights, he remained largely silent except to demand a lawyer. However, the evidence against him was overwhelming. His pistol, the attempted murder of Marcus, Sarah's testimony, and the phone records that would eventually be uncovered would paint a clear picture of his criminal activities. Detective Rodriguez had seen similar cases before, and she knew that David was likely part of a larger trafficking network that would need to be investigated and dismantled. Marcus provided a detailed statement to the police, walking them through his observations, his decision-making process, and the events that led to the confrontation. The officers were impressed by his tactical awareness and his restraint in handling a situation that could have easily escalated beyond control. His military background and calm demeanor under pressure had undoubtedly saved Sarah's life and prevented David from escaping to continue his criminal activities. While the police processed the crime scene and gathered evidence, Sarah began the difficult process of recounting her 3-day ordeal to Detective Rodriguez. The story that emerged was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Sarah had been a naive 19-year-old college student working part-time at a retail store in Atlanta when David first contacted her through social media. He had presented himself as a talent scout for a legitimate modeling agency, complete with fake credentials and a professional-looking portfolio of supposedly successful models he had discovered. The elaborate deception had continued for weeks of online communication before David convinced Sarah to meet him in person. He had chosen his victim carefully, targeting a young woman who came from a modest background and had dreams of escaping her circumstances through modeling success. Sarah's family situation had made her particularly vulnerable. Her parents were divorced, her mother worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, and Sarah herself was struggling to pay for college while maintaining her grades. When David had picked Sarah up from the coffee shop for what was supposed to be a brief meeting with photographers, he had immediately begun isolating her from any means of communication or escape. The first red flag should have been when he insisted she leave her phone in his car, for security reasons. But Sarah had been too excited about her supposed opportunity to question his instructions. By the time she realized something was wrong, she was already hundreds of miles from home with no way to contact anyone for help. Detective Rodriguez explained to Sarah that she had been intended for sale to buyers who would have transported her even farther, from her home and family, likely to another state or even another country. The detective had investigated similar cases where young women simply vanished into criminal networks and were never seen by their families again. Sarah's quick thinking, with the Morse code SOS signal and Marcus's military training, had combined to prevent her from becoming another missing person. The investigation that followed would eventually reveal that David was part of an interstate trafficking ring that had been operating for several years. His arrest led to the discovery of other victims and eventually to the takedown of several related criminal organizations. Sarah's case became a crucial piece of evidence that helped prosecutors build cases against multiple defendants involved in the trafficking network. Marcus declined interviews with local news media who arrived at the scene, preferring to let law enforcement handle the public information aspects of the case. He was more concerned with ensuring that Sarah received proper care and that David faced appropriate charges for his crimes. The former Marine had never sought recognition for his military service overseas, and he felt no need for public attention now that he was back in civilian life. As the immediate crisis passed and the various law enforcement agencies began their investigations, Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the realization of how close she had come to disappearing forever. The trauma of her experience would require professional counseling and the support of her family and friends, but she was alive and free because of the actions of a stranger who had recognized her desperate signal for help. Detective Rodriguez arranged for Sarah to be reunited with her frantic mother, who had been searching for her daughter since she failed to return home from what was supposed to be a brief meeting about a modeling opportunity. The reunion was emotional and overwhelming for both women, who had feared they might never see each other again. The detective also ensured that Sarah would receive victim services support and counseling to help her recover from the psychological trauma of her ordeal. Marcus completed his statements and evidence collection with the police, then quietly prepared to continue his journey home to Texas. He had been delayed by many hours, but that seemed insignificant compared to the importance of what had been accomplished. As he walked back toward his pickup truck, Sarah approached him with her mother, wanting to thank the man who had risked his life to save her from an unimaginable fate. Sarah approached Marcus with tears in her eyes, her mother beside her offering support and encouragement. For a moment, neither Sarah nor her mother could find words adequate to express their gratitude to this stranger, who had literally saved Sarah's life and future. Marcus, uncomfortable with emotional situations and praise, simply nodded and assured them that any decent person would have done the same thing when faced with such circumstances. "You saved my daughter's life," Sarah's mother, Patricia Mitchell, finally managed to say through her own tears. "I don't know how to thank you for bringing her back to me." Marcus shook his head gently, maintaining the humble demeanor that had characterized his military service and his approach to life in general. "She saved herself," he replied. "That SOS signal took real courage and quick thinking. I just happened to be someone who recognized it." Sarah wanted to tell Marcus about how hopeless she had felt before he appeared, about the 3 days of fear and desperation that had nearly broken her spirit. She wanted to explain how his calm competence and willingness to risk his own safety had given her strength to keep fighting when she thought all was lost, but the words seemed inadequate to convey the depth of her gratitude and relief. Detective Rodriguez joined the conversation, informing them that David would be facing multiple serious charges including kidnapping, human trafficking, attempted murder, and weapons violations. The detective explained that Sarah's case had provided crucial evidence that would help prosecute not only David, but other members of his criminal network. Sarah's courage in signaling for help and testifying about her experience would potentially save other young women from similar fates. In the weeks that followed, the full scope of the criminal network began to emerge through the investigation. David's phone records and financial transactions revealed connections to traffickers in multiple states, leading to a coordinated law enforcement operation that resulted in numerous arrests and the rescue of several other trafficking victims. Sarah's case had been the key that unlocked a much larger criminal conspiracy. Marcus returned to his normal life in Texas, going back to his construction job and the quiet routine he had established after his military service. He gave testimony when required for David's prosecution, but otherwise preferred to avoid the media attention that the case generated. Several news outlets wanted to interview him about his heroic actions, but Marcus consistently declined, believing that the focus should remain on supporting trafficking victims rather than celebrating individual acts of intervention. Sarah began the long process of healing from her traumatic experience with the help of professional counselors who specialized in trafficking victim recovery. She returned to college with a new perspective on life and a determination to use her experience to help other young women avoid similar situations. She became involved with organizations that educated teenagers about online safety and the tactics used by traffickers to target vulnerable young people. The trial of David Chen became a landmark case in the state's fight against human trafficking. His conviction on all charges resulted in a sentence of 25 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. The other members of his network received similar sentences, effectively dismantling an operation that had victimized dozens of young women over several years. Sarah's testimony during the trial was described by prosecutors as courageous and compelling, helping to ensure that these criminals would never again have the opportunity to harm innocent people. Marcus and Sarah maintained contact after the incident, with Sarah sending occasional updates about her recovery and her advocacy work. She graduated from college with honors and went on to pursue a career in social work, specializing in helping trafficking victims rebuild their lives. Her experience had transformed her from a naive teenager into a strong advocate for vulnerable people, and she credited Marcus's example of selfless action as inspiration for her career choice. 5 years after the incident at the rest stop, Sarah organized a public awareness event about human trafficking prevention. She invited Marcus to attend, not as a guest speaker but simply as someone she wanted to honor privately for his role in changing her life. Marcus attended quietly, proud of what Sarah had accomplished but still uncomfortable with being recognized for actions he considered simply the right thing to do. The Georgia rest stop where the incident occurred eventually installed additional security, cameras and emergency call systems as part of a statewide initiative to make travel stops safer for vulnerable people. A small plaque near the building commemorated the location as a place where vigilance and courage had triumphed over criminal exploitation, though it did not mention Marcus or Sarah by name at their request. Marcus often reflected on the random circumstances that had brought him to that rest stop at exactly the right moment to help Sarah. He had been driving home from visiting his aging mother, had stopped for coffee at that particular location by chance, and had happened to recognize an obscure military signal that most civilians would never have understood. The convergence of these factors had meant the difference between life and freedom for a young woman he had never met before that day. The Afur story became a teaching case used by law enforcement agencies to train officers in recognizing signs of human trafficking and responding appropriately to rescue situations. It demonstrated the importance of public awareness, the value of military training in civilian emergency situations, and the power of individual courage to make a difference in the face of organized criminal activity. Most importantly, it showed that sometimes ordinary people in ordinary circumstances have the opportunity to perform extraordinary acts of heroism, simply by paying attention to those around them and being willing to act when action is needed.